So I'd like to invite Professor Reem Hajjar to the stage, as well as the panelists. Distinguished panelists, please come on up. And this is what we've all been waiting for. So a really robust discussion of the future of forests and livelihoods. And Reem Hajjar is an associate professor at Oregon State University who is well known for her work on community forests and many other aspects relevant to FLAIR, and who is one of the, I would say, founders of FLAIR, longest standing members and steering committee member of FLAIR. So I'm very grateful to her for all of her contributions to the network, and particularly for moderating this session. So Reem, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, thanks for the invitation to moderate this panel, and hopefully, yes, this is something that we've all been waiting for. I think it's going to be a fantastic panel. I will introduce the panelists shortly, just to sort of set the stage of what our goals are here for this panel today. Katya, it's great to see all the impacts that FLAIR has had, and as Dan mentioned, I've been there since the start, and I've certainly felt the building of community and the opportunities through FLAIR, so that was fantastic. Looking back at the last 10 years, the goal of this panel is to look towards the future, towards the next 5 to 10 years of FLAIR and of research and policy and action around forests and livelihoods. I think a lot has happened in this field in the past 10 years since the Paris Climate COP, which is where we started. Our first FLAIR was in conjunction with that. And in the next decade, we're looking at the end of the current SDGs, which for sure all of which we will surely achieve. And 30 by 30 targets and other international goals and agendas, but also just growing grassroots movements pushing for environmental and social issues. And I'd say a very fast-changing research landscape in terms of the themes that are being addressed and staying up to date with all these real-world changes, but also in terms of methodologies that are being adopted. So with all that in mind, Dan has put together this panel of experts sort of representing diverse perspectives from different parts of the globe, different sectors. We have academics, we have community organizers, we have government or funding agencies, and even across generations. Representative from the youth perspective, as well as less young views. Me included. All right, so we've asked each panelist to share some opening remarks, essentially just where they think the most important considerations, challenges, opportunities for forest livelihoods, research, policy, and or action, what's happening now and what is coming down the line in 5 to 10 years. And so each panelist, and I'll introduce you individually as you're making your remarks, they're gonna speak for 4 to 5 minutes, giving a short perspective. Then we'll start a discussion. I will pose some questions to our panelists before opening it up to the broader audience, and getting your questions, but also your views on some of these topics. And all of that in the next 55 minutes. So let's get started with that. So I think to open the panel, we will start with Jonathan Rigg. Jonathan is a professor and chair in human geography at the University of Bristol. He's very well known for his work on sustainable rural livelihoods, including a new framework that he's put out recently that really centers relational power and links to change, climate change, environmental change and such, which I think everybody should check out. And we're going to hear his perspective sort of on the broader, big picture around sustainable rural livelihoods.
Lovely. Thanks, Reem. Well, real pleasure to be here. Many thanks, Reem, Dan, Brian, all the organisers. I suppose at some point we'll give them applause and so on. It's been fantastic, my first FLAIR conference, and it's wonderful to be here. A little bit of a fraud because I'm not really a forest person. I'm a rural livelihoods person, so my engagement with forests certainly comes at the kind of farm forest margin. Now, I've written my notes down so that I stick to 4 minutes. And what I want to do is use Nepal as a way into this debate regarding the nexus between livelihoods and forests. So, before the turn of the millennium, Nepal was facing a crisis of deforestation in the mid-hills. Forests were being denuded, were retreating with repercussions for rural livelihoods, and especially for the poor. Today, in many areas, forests are advancing, encroaching on farmland. Rather than being important components in producing sustainable livelihoods, they are, in some instances, compromising livelihoods. What on earth is going on? How do we come to understand this profound shift? Nepal's economic stagnation, in no small part due to poor governance and political instability, left many households in the late 20th century facing declining incomes, living standards, and rising poverty. Rural livelihoods were being squeezed. At the same time, countries in the Middle East, in the South and East Asia had become major labour importers. Nepalese responded to this combination of a lack of opportunities at home and availability of work overseas to leave the country. In 2000, there were about 30,000 Nepalese working overseas. In 2017, there were 600,000. Over half of Nepali households have at least one member of their family working and living abroad. And many of these households are rural, the large majority are male, and their remittances contribute about 1/4 of Nepal's GDP. So what are the implications of that for forests and livelihoods? The absence of men has meant that women have taken over many farming tasks. There's occurred what's sometimes termed a feminization of farming. These families also have, however, received remittances from their sons and husbands working overseas. This income provides the option to disintensify farming and withdraw from some agricultural activities, such as herding. Households are, relatively speaking, cash-rich and labour-poor. Rather than collecting firewood, they can buy alternative fuels. More distant fields are left idle, even abandoned long-term. These fields are being colonised by regrowth, and some by forest. As the forest encroaches, so do wild animals. Deer, wild pigs, monkeys forage in the fields that continue to be cultivated, making farming a marginal and, for some women, a fearful business. This creates a further reason to retreat from cultivating the forest margins. The dynamics of forest transition in the mid-hills of Nepal is tied to livelihood transitions, and these in turn to translocal transformations in the global economy. The fields and forests of the mid-hills are remittance landscapes. They are shaped by migration. Migration in turn is linked to structures in local society. The fact, for example, that men migrate and women tend to stay at home. In the Philippines, it's not like this. The remittances generated from migration could be invested in farming, but mainly they are not. They're invested in education so that the young can acquire the skills to escape from farming. Forests that previously had been cut back and denuded to extend farming, feed livestock, provide fuel for cooking and heating, and to support livelihoods regenerate. Here's the thing. A tree in the field in the mid-hills of Nepal, an advancing forest fringe, a growing population of wild pigs. These matters are at once local and translocal, environmental and political, agriculture, eroding, and livelihood enhancing. The mid-hills of Nepal is just one example, and perhaps an exceptional one, at that, of the things that we have been exploring, I think, over the last 2 days. It's exemplary, I think, in showing how the forest livelihood nexus, I guess Melissa's lifeways that she talked about yesterday, evolves in an era of globalization.
Thank you, Jonathan. Indeed, very thought-provoking overview of forest transitions and livelihoods transitions and the variable effects of migration on these. Next, I would like to turn to, is it okay? Sarobidy Rakotonarivo from the University of Antananarivo. Sarobidy is the research group lead of the Mitsilo research group, and that does a lot of fantastic social science and interdisciplinary research on conservation and rural livelihoods and such in Madagascar, and is can provide us with a perspective of a very community-engaged researcher.
Yeah, thank you, Reem and Dan. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and take part in this panel discussion. So there are 3 points I want to convey in my opening remarks. So the first one is on the high price that local communities have to pay to conserve tropical forests. The second is on the gap between policy intention and evidence on the social impacts of conservation. And the last one is the need for a widespread culture shift if you want to see more just and more effective outcomes for people as well as for forests. So my research for the past 20 years in Africa suggests that forest conservation and especially restrictions on forest use and access imposed by conservation can result in significant costs for local communities and can even make them poorer. Where you've got people who are really dependent on clearing forest land for agriculture, then if that forest is conserved, then inevitably there is a cost to these people. But the problem is that we refuse to acknowledge that there are people who might lose out from the restrictions imposed by conservation. And I feel that we don't need to portray local communities as the guardians or eco-friendly to see that they have rights. They are the ones doing deforestation and they have customary rights. They are deserving of compensations. And we, donors, scholars, and policymakers and practitioners, we need to recognize that sometimes we are the bad guys for not recognizing the rights of the local people to the land and also the high price that they have to pay to conserve forests. And then the second point on this gap between policy intention and evidence. Of course, it's long been recognized that the global good of conservation should not be paid for by those least able to bear additional costs, and conservation could only succeed if it also reduces poverty. This is reflected in several commitments, such as the Earth Summit in 1992, and then the 2004 World Park Congress, and then parties to the conventions on, for biodiversity conservation, Convention on Biological Diversity. However, I argue that despite these policy commitments, there is hardly any evidence on the positive net impacts of protected areas and forests more generally on the welfare of forest-dependent communities. And I believe that one of the reasons for this lack of evidence on the social net costs or net impacts is the myth of win-win and optimism bias. So what I mean by that is that there are often overly optimistic projections of potential benefit of conservation and forests in planning documents. And we mostly focus on the potential benefits of nature, the climate, and the biodiversity benefits. And we don't consider the timing and the extent of realized benefits to people, the benefits from ecosystem services, such as clean air or water, and where and when they occur, to not necessarily match the burden that are immediately borne by local communities. And I don't want to be the outlier here in this panel and also in this entire room, but I think the last point is that we are yet to see a widespread culture shift that recognizes the level of funding and also the change that's required to ensure that forests and protected areas in the global south generate net positive outcomes for both people and forests, and how to elaborate on these radical shifts or changes that are required, especially now that the world has embarked on the 30 by 30 target. Thank you, Reem.
Thank you. I am definitely going to come back on several of those points that you've made. So our next speaker is Hugo Jabini, who is a human rights defender working with the Association of Saamaka Communities in Suriname. He was the co-recipient of the Goldman Environmental Prize for the work that he's done fighting for land rights in Suriname and against logging on ancestral lands. And he will be providing the community activist perspective on this look forward to forests and livelihoods.
Nano, I greet you all on behalf of my people. The Saamaka, who are Afro-descendant tribe who have inhabited the Amazon rainforest of Suriname for almost 300 years. We have rights similar to indigenous people, including ownership rights to our ancestral land. We have lived sustainably protecting about 1.4 million hectares of Amazon rainforest, which we have inherited generation after generation. Because our existence as tribal people is deeply connected to forest, our existence is at risk due to the threats we face. In 2007, we maintained to win a court case against the state of Suriname for violation of our land rights. The International Court of Human Rights obliged Suriname to legally recognize our land rights, stop with all forest destructive activities, refrain from granting concession within our lands unless free, prior informed consent, social environmental impact assessment, and a fair benefit share. 70 years after the landmark Saamaka judgment of the International Court of Human Rights, we are still waiting for the government of Suriname to legally recognize our collective rights on land and to stop the destruction of our home. On contrary, deforestation due to logging and mining has increased within our lands fourfold since 2007. So it seems that the international legal instruments alone cannot guarantee the effective protection of human rights, nor prevent the destruction of our forests, our homes situated in the most intact part of the Amazon rainforest. And the question is now, for how long will this take place? And I think it's now a question for you as a researcher, because I'm just a human rights defender, a forest defender, but you have the expertise and the knowledge and the possibility to help us analyze and find out how this international instrument can be more effective to have impact on the ground for the people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugo. This is definitely a stark case of ineffectiveness of international law, and so hopefully we can return to this idea of policy implementation gaps in our discussion. So next up we have Eva Marie Garces-Foley. She's an undergraduate student at the University of Notre Dame, majoring in anthropology and peace studies. As a student and an activist, and has been highly involved in various research projects as well as student organizing activities. And she will be presenting us with the youth and the youth activist perspective on the questions ahead.
Thank you, Reem, and also thank you to Professor Miller and to my fellow panelists. I feel very grateful to be part of this discussion. This is also my first Flare conference, and I also want to thank all of you for how welcoming you've made this space to new students and early career people who are coming into this field. I learned so much this weekend and I feel very, very grateful. In thinking about the youth perspective and what is this question of the youth perspective, obviously my youth perspective comes from my positionality as growing up in the US, as attending an elite university in the US. And I think from that I have this perspective of the students around me that I attend university with and young people today. How are we thinking about climate change? And I see kind of a disconnect between this kind of looming cloud of climate change and looming cloud of deforestation and environmental degradation as being disconnected from our understanding of the kind of physical ways that this can manifest in natural disasters, in climate migration, in forest fires and things like that. And I think of how the youth today are seeing climate change and forest degradation as being kind of in the digital realm. And I saw this quote on Twitter, actually, that I thought really spoke to that. It reads, "Climate change will manifest as a series of disasters viewed through phones, footage that gets closer and closer to where you live until you're the one filming it." And I think of, first of all, this kind of resigning to being passive viewers of climate change and how that can kind of lead to our apathy, our being kind of young people's apathy and almost like a paralyzing apathy relating to climate change and our care for forests. And also additionally thinking about what is the footage that is meaningful to us and what is the footage that isn't meaningful to us. Why is it that we can watch something of thousands of people dying in floods in Pakistan and then not care as much about seeing hundreds of people dying in a hurricane in North Carolina? And what is that kind of positionality of what climate disasters move us and what climate disasters don't move us? And so thinking about this paralyzing disconnection, I see a lot of hopelessness and I see a lot of surrender and I see a lot of resignation within youth today who are really crucial in the future of the fight for forests and livelihoods and climate change in general. But there is a kind of a lack of a driving movement that I'm especially seeing on college campuses. And so I think of Nadia Abou-El-Hajj's idea of disavowal as a way to justify maintaining the upholding orders in the face of what is, for us, ample evidence, ample scientific evidence, logical evidence of the urgency of climate change. And so I think of this idea that Nadia Abou-El-Hajj suggests of I know very well, but all the same. What happens when the youth have all of the scientific knowledge about climate change, about the importance of forests, about the importance of forests for livelihoods, but that still isn't driving us to kind of take up the action that needs to be taken up. And I was really grateful to hear yesterday in Melissa Leach's keynote address that maybe along with the scientific and the logical and the economic knowledge that is driving policy change and change in general, maybe we need to add this layer of care and passion and love for the environment and the human connection that we can have with the environment. Because the reality that I see is that facts for the youth are not enough. And I think about the US presidential election that's coming in just about a month and climate change not even really being a topic of conversation. And so what happens when the rational argument isn't enough to convince young people to start caring? What happens when the science that is right in front of us isn't being listened to and isn't enough to drive people to say, you know, maybe I shouldn't be a mass consumer, maybe it's time for me to change the upheld orders. And so I would argue that a way that I hope that the youth can start to care a little bit more about forests and about livelihoods and about climate change is fostering love for forests that I think many of us feel, that I think drives many of our research. And I think much of that comes from conversation with Hugo and the other panelists yesterday, and indigenous knowledge and indigenous worldviews and spiritualities relating to the environment and how there is a strong human nature connection and the connection that we can have with our non-living community that we also discussed yesterday in the keynote address, and how that can be fostered within young people to see the environment as something that we love and care about, and even if the scientific facts, although they are there and plenty, are not enough to get people to start caring. What if love of the environment can be that push forward? And so I just want to kind of end this address by saying that we know that from the younger generation that when we care about something, we can have a huge impact. We can have huge drives of social movement, both on social media and in real life. And so when we begin to care about something, we know that we can make a difference. And so my hope for the future of my generation and moving forward in Forest Livelihoods is that young people can begin to care a little bit more through love and passion for the environment that I think we all feel in this room. So, thank you.
Thank you, Eva Marie, for those comments. I think will resonate a lot with a lot of educators amongst us here. Because it really is, part of the responsibility is the role of educators in inspiring and engendering hope in our students and helping them shake that helplessness off and to push for a better everything. I also get a lot of my inspiration from my students and seeing students across the U.S. and across the world, especially this past year, being so active and pushing us to rethink our narratives and our agendas. So thank you for that. So our last panelist is James Connell. Now we're going to zoom out to the perspective of a national development agency that provides a lot of the funding that funds the work that we do. James is a team lead in the Joint International Forest Unit at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. He works on strategy and multilateral negotiations and does a lot of work in sort of helping the UK government prioritize its climate and livelihood work. So, please.
Thank you, Reem. Blimey, I have the slightly unenviable task of being the government suit to follow for utterly tremendous presentations. The first thing I'd like to say is thanks. This is also my first flare. It's been a tremendously enriching 2 days. I've definitely learned more than I've contributed, and I think I'll be buzzing for quite a while after this. I'd also like to just very briefly alight on the presentation by Katja earlier. It was really inspiring to see this reflected value around community. It's something I really identified with and I thought was hugely hugely inspiring and reassuring. I'd also like to say, of those articles that were put up on the screen, I think I've got all of those in my core script, which if any of you don't know what a core script is, it's a pretty, it's one of those horrible sort of bureaucratic contrivances, but it's essentially where we keep all of our evidence to persuade policymakers and to help them to think about these issues in a robust way. So yeah, it's making an impact. Secondly, my positionality following Evie, I serve as a government policy advisor and a negotiator, as Reem said. In the past, I worked as a researcher and as an ethnographer. I'm not going to pretend that I have anything like your expertise, particularly those of you from forest country settings, but I hope it does allow me some appreciation of both fields and the real impact that they can have when we come together. We were asked to consider key challenges and opportunities we see for forest livelihoods, research and policy now and in the coming 5 to 10 years. That time point is really significant. In 5 years, we will hit the SDG target, the UNFF Global Forest Goals target, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration target to halt and reverse forest and nature loss. 2030 will pose a critical watershed for the hopes of a 1.5 degree future for a world free from poverty on a livable planet, which is the express vision of our government. I want to use Professor Leach's Lifeways approach. I think it's really enriching. This relational ontology helps reimagine our agenda by considering the material and cultural importance of forests, including for climate and for carbon. While acknowledging the challenges in these discourses, I would also suggest that they too offer a vital way to relate to significant risks and recognise the deep connection that we all have to global forests. I hope that the establishment of the UK's International Forest Unit, which integrates development and climate work across our development and our climate ministries, offers reassurance that bridging this dialectic, recognising that climate, nature and development are inextricably linked, is something that the UK takes incredibly seriously. The IFU collaborates with partners to drive a shift towards a forest-positive economy. We work to support global efforts to halt and reverse deforestation and forest degradation by 2030, while supporting livelihoods focusing on three main issues. One, around enhancing governance and tackling illegality, including by deepening protections for IPRCs through regularising land tenure and increasing access to finance. Second, and this goes to Sarobidy's point, scaling finance for forests from all sources, ensuring that forests are properly valued and that the efforts of those who steward global public goods like forests are rewarded. And third, building a forest-positive economy through decoupling agricultural production from deforestation, including by supporting the development of sustainable green value chains. These are the big things, where your research is already making a huge difference, but you can also add value to several other more specific ways too. First, deepening political will is crucial, including by emphasising the urgency of action on forests as essential for people, nature and climate. The importance of healthy biodiverse forests and forest services for lives, livelihoods, food, water, energy, health security is beyond doubt. But despite public support for forests, progress is slow and risks crossing critical tipping points in several biomes. Forest loss continues at a high rate, with alarming impacts of lives and livelihoods. I'd like to take this moment to express sympathy and concern for the people of Brazil who have faced really significant fires across the region recently. Fundamentally, care for forests is not translating into action as quickly as what is needed. Despite our concerns with climatisation, for instance, and I've heard these and I think they're enormously valid. From my perspective, it can sometimes be quite challenging to get the climate people to take forests as a climate solution, both for mitigation and adaptation, seriously. It's vital that we work together to ensure that we tell this story, to help put forests at the heart of decision making, and your support for that is essential. Second, you can help us communicate complex science and chart a way forward by developing a practical synthesis that speaks across paradigms. This will allow policymakers to make well-informed decisions grounded in science, but vitally in a way that does no harm. There are real tensions with this agenda. Fundamentally, how to navigate livelihoods and lives while protecting the natural world in a climate-impacted world. Your ability to illuminate pathways and imagine new ways to build consensus and collaboration is invaluable. I won't go into all of the issues and trade-offs that are on our agenda. Many of you have spoken to them over these weekends, over the course of this weekend. Agriculture, deforestation, linkages, for instance, nature, climate, livelihood linkages and trade-offs. Issues around restoration versus protection and sustainable management, and tensions within the livelihoods debate as well, around whether or not we valorise or essentialise and depoliticise Indigenous people and local communities and fail to understand their own histories and subjective realities. Research is crucial for understanding and creating meaning. You provide not just data, but you also challenge us, question assumptions, you hold us to account, and it is valued. Finally, in a year when all three Rio conventions meet, I was going to say something about multilateralism. But listening to conversations this weekend and from colleagues like Evie, Andrea, I think I spotted in the audience, we spoke last night, there's a bigger point around the politics of representation and collective action. As per my initial point, it's crucial to rebuild trust in institutions, move past perceptions of empty rhetoric and deliver progress. But how do we ensure that conversations are truly inclusive and representative? What can we do to enable meaningful participation without falling into tokenism or passing the buck to the most vulnerable? It highlights the balance between structure and agency from one of Jonathan's papers, actually, and emphasises the need to differentiate policy issues from political issues. Professor Leach highlighted yesterday that this also involves bridging diverse life worlds. Before attending FLAIR, A Colombian colleague of mine shared the difficulties she faced in discussing the economic significance of trees in carbon capture with IPLC communities. She remarked that when what we see as forests to IPLCs are a universe. Ladies and gentlemen, the urgency of finding a common language here is paramount. As researchers, this is your gift. We could hardly need it more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great way to sort of outline, where we want to be headed, but at the same time, what we've been struggling to accomplish. And I think that leads very nicely into the first question I want to ask the panelists about this idea of policy implementation. Sarobidy spoke of policy intentions and unintended consequences of policies. Hugo, you spoke of sort of ineffectiveness of international laws, which you would think would be the strongest form of policy leading to strong implementation, and that has not happened. I was wondering if, we often talk about the gap between science and policy, not communicating our science well to policymakers and such, but there's also this gap between policy intention and the actual implementation and how these unintended consequences may be coming about. And I'm wondering, trying to think of this in a more solutions-oriented way, in a future-looking way. Where are we going wrong, and what can we do better? Is it about science communication? Is it about social science integration, better social science integration, so that we understand better why we're failing at these areas and ways forward? Broadly speaking, or speaking from your specific cases, would maybe one of you two like to start the conversation? Everybody else can just jump in.
So earlier I was touching on this lack of evidence on the social impacts of forest conservation, and I think this lack of evidence severely limits our ability to lobby donors for adequate funding to make conservation more effective and more just. And we need to provide the evidence by implementing a culture of evaluation in conservation and environmental programs more generally. And over scholars like Paul Ferraro or Dan or Johan have made these calls before, and here I just want to echo them again, that we need to strive to put in place a more rigorous evaluation system to understand and also to quantify the impacts generated by conservation, as well as alternative livelihoods or other policy instruments on local people, and lobby donors for realistic funding per household and also per hectare, like how much do we actually need to increase by X% people's income, or to reduce by X% some dimensions of poverty. And we need to understand the distribution and also the mechanisms behind these impacts. If protected areas are further extended without this evidence and also adequate funding that matches the evidence on the level of the resources required, then they are going to be paid for by local communities, and you are just going to repeat the mistakes of the past. And then the second solution I want to propose is that real change must come from empowering local people to defend their own rights. And implementing a socially just and right-based approach to conservation, it's a slow and difficult process, and we must resist the urge to cut corners. We need to commit to implementing free, prior, and informed consent. And I feel that there continues to be serious resistance in state agencies to empowering local communities to manage and own their forest, and also to implement a genuine free, prior, and informed consent. And we scholars here and also like practitioners, we need to counter this resistance, and research alone is enough. We need to engage with policy, we need to invest in building the capacity of local communities if you are really serious about forests and biodiversity and climate change. And then the last point is more recognition, better recognition of land rights. It's good, it's humane, but it's not enough. And we also need to look for solutions outside the conservation and the forest sector. Poverty reduction depends on changes in enabling conditions and not single interventions. And some combinations of strengthened institutions and local governance, also increased opportunities outside the forest sector, off-farm, and also entrepreneurial activities to support also like out-migration and investment in education, sustainable agricultural intensification. These are all needed to implement a more just and effective conservation. And all of these solutions need to be embedded in this culture of impact evaluation to know what works, what doesn't work, and why. Thank you.
I think she's figured it out, folks. Hugo, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I just want to add some compliment, make it to complement it. I think implementation of good policy will means that we have to create a situation for people on the ground to have a better, so that policymakers have a better understanding of the language of forest, because it's the people on the ground, the forest dependent people, the local community, the indigenous people, they are part of the forest, so they understand the language of the forest better. And science this must be able to reduce the gap between policy and the reality. So I totally agree that conservation based on the knowledge, based on the wisdom of the local communities, if we believe, as far as I hear, that forest is the solution to climate change, then we have to make sure that policymakers better reconnect with the reality on the ground. So, and supporting community members, supporting their system, a combination of the scientific, also innovation solution with the reality of the people who maintain to protect forests for centuries, that will help us to make sure that the deforestation and actually the capitalism, the greedy way of the modern world, that you want to take more than you need, and that's make that the nature, we have disbalanced the whole system of nature.
Yeah, I'm becoming increasingly disillusioned with the effectiveness of international law and thinking more towards the solutions are going to be local. But having said that, I want to ask James to comment as the policymaker on the panel, what his thoughts are.
Sure, thanks, Reem. I really, both of my co-panelists, I think, have said enormously rich things there. I think this concept of culture of impact evaluation is absolutely right, and also kind of this need to connect with realities on the ground. And I think been sort of around development for a while. That's a sort of, it's a fundamental principle by which we should be conducting our activities, our work. If I may, I think just a couple of reflections on how we use science. So, I think the first thing to say, quite bluntly, is it's used to make the case. Ministers, political colleagues, people who work politically have limited time, limited money, limited capacity in their heads to hold all of the things that they need to hold to make decisions. There's often a quite ferocious landscape of competing priorities that people like me, civil servants, people who work as government officials, and others, you have a similar sort of situation. We have to try to cut through that and make the case as strongly as we can. So I think, in a world where government rightly needs to optimise resources, people, money and time, we use that science, that evidence to weigh up what matters to secure those resources, and whichever one of those it is, to prioritise. We use it to identify options for action, and we use it to evaluate and improve, so following Sarobidy's point, including by finding new frameworks for action and for thinking. I think my personal reflection on this is the science is extraordinarily rich across this agenda, but that can also make it quite challenging to navigate. It can be difficult and time-consuming to weigh up the value of contradictory evidence, for instance, and contradictory positions, and then navigate the institutional, the ontological, the epistemological differences you guys have, right? There's a politics to research too. It's not a single voice with a single set of views, and that incurs a demand on us to try to navigate some of those, to navigate that very complicated landscape and to make decisions with incomplete or imperfect information. I've been reading a book by Simon Sharp, I think his name is, called 5 Times Faster. It's mostly a climate book around the need to go faster on tackling some of these challenges. One of his reflections, being an academic as well, on the difference between academia and policy, is that structurally academia tends to privilege originality. It's the key part of a PhD thesis, right? An original contribution to knowledge. Whereas policy needs to hear relevance. So I think that is absolutely in no way to contradict the need for blue sky thinking, for we call it the Haldane principle, right, for protecting that. It's utterly critical. But we need to find a way to pull that relevance out of some of the work that is out there and to land it. Again, if I may, I find I was an anthropologist, so I find anthropology, sociology sometimes has the hardest job here. I always find that anthropologists have had an idea 30 years ago that are then rediscovered by sociologists and rediscovered by an economist, only to be listened to. So I think there's a need to try to make those sort of social science disciplines, which I care deeply around, more digestible for policymakers, frankly, for that critique that's so critical, sorry, pardon, sort of the pun, to make it accessible and to have positive solutions and suggestions within that to inform our work and to help us to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you to the three of you for that. I think all three of you articulated this really strong role for researchers in this space, and I think that's really helpful. I think a lot of us struggle with this feeling that, hey, we're doing this awesome research, but it's not really having an impact. And so thanks for keeping the hope alive that we're making a difference here. I do want to switch to the next topic and just keeping my eye on the time here. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that came up very, very strongly with Melissa Leach's talk yesterday. She really centering justice as a framing for the way forward for forests and livelihoods and people-forest relationships. And some of you have spoken about sort of injustices, climate injustices and otherwise in your remarks. And I wanted to see if you had some more to say about how you see environmental and social justice intersecting with your own work and activism and such on forests and livelihoods moving forward. And I was thinking maybe Evie, you could start us off.
Sure. So yeah, I particularly appreciated the justice approach from Melissa Leach's address yesterday, particularly because a lot of my education has come from peace studies, and justice is so core to peace building and peace studies research. And one of the things that's kind of core to peace studies at the Kroc Institute at Notre Dame is I'm really grateful to the way that they use a justice-based approach in peace building is the sustainability of justice as peace is not the absence of violence, but it's the presence of having systems that can promote sustainable peace. And so when I think about kind of the people-forest relationships and how these can be fostered to have systems that promote justice with people in relation to their forests, I think about the research that I've conducted. I've just done like a small project over the summer, but it was looking at trust and power dynamics between local indigenous communities in the Alto Maya region of Peru and conservation organizations, and how can justice be a part of this? I think largely it's the trust that needs to be fostered between the kind of organizational side of conservation and the importance of like having justice and agency and trust with local populations and seeing their voices as so incredibly important. And oftentimes I think, especially as I've learned in my peace studies education, there's this kind of we know what's best for you approach that conservation organizations, mostly Western conservation organizations, can take to conservation and to have that power dynamic existing in their relationships with local stakeholders. And so I think that having a sustainable approach to justice and kind of fighting that sort of colonial we know what's best for you framework is really important going forward. And that also I think speaks to, as was discussed, with decolonizing education and kind of having the justice framework existing in education for future scholars of this field. And so, yeah.
Would anyone else like to jump in, please?
I really appreciate Melissa's talk yesterday, and I understand where she's coming from. But I'm a bit concerned that, like all these over dimensions of justice that she talked about, they're going to distract us from the real socioeconomic trade-offs between conservation and development. And I feel that we want to go too fast because my experience is that even this idea of equity, distributive equity, like local people needing to sharing the benefits of conservation, and also the procedural equity, communities that need to have their voices heard and take part in the decision-making processes. We still need to get those rights and to understand what they actually mean in practice. So, of course, there are. Melissa was advocating for all these justice dimensions, but I think we need to do it right and not sidestep these fundamental aspects of justice first. Thank you.
Does anybody want to respond to that?
Yeah, I might just kind of echo what you were just saying. I think, if you go back to sort of Clifford Geertz's work on shared poverty, more recently, Deepesh Chakrabarty, the historian in Chicago, that, we're all in the same lifeboat. We're not. Shared poverty just doesn't work in an era when our interests have diverged in important ways. So I think, how justice on the ground is taken forward in a way that doesn't privilege some groups over others, some spaces over others, some countries over others. I think that's a real challenge. And I think when Clifford Geertz was working in Java in the 1960s, maybe it was possible to talk about communities of shared poverty. But now when you go into rural communities, people's interests are bifurcated in really significant ways. And how justice gets taken forward in a manner that isn't unjust is, I think, a real challenge for us all.
Other comments on that? Okay. So I'm gonna, again, switch topics. Sorry for the whiplash here, but we are already short on time. I've already decided we're gonna go over. Okay, Dan, I hope you're okay with that. A topic that also was addressed in Melissa's talk yesterday was the idea of debunking myths. and she spoke of the deforestation narrative in her case study as this myth that needed debunking, and had me wondering about what other narratives out there in the world around forests and people need either debunking or rethinking or just interrogating from a normative standpoint, but also from evidence-based standpoint, right, where evidence might be in dispute or just unclear. I'm not sure who wants to start us off with that. Okay, I'm gonna pick on you, Jonathan. Get us started.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an old miserable contrarian, so I love it when I love the paradoxes and puzzles that, those kind of get me going more than, a bit like the kind of Nepal story. I mean, it was a real work in Nepal. I didn't expect it. I think, wow, what's going on here? And just to kind of connect this with the first question, I think, in a way, the problem we've got is too much evidence, not too little. I think we know too much about stuff, and the kind of question is, sort of, what do we select and how do we do it? If you're anything like me, I've got papers that I've written that I thought were quite good, and I honestly say this, I don't think anyone has ever read them. So, you sort of think, wow, all that effort, no impact whatsoever, zero. And others, for reasons which I just puzzle me, they just, for whatever reason, they take off. People read them, and you think, how did that happen? So when you come to the sort of debunking, what is it that captures the moment? Why does some books and papers, suddenly everyone's reading them? And I suppose debunking is, well, if you're anything like me, I love reading things which make me think differently about the world. I suppose my personal kind of favourite, this is, we go off quite a while, is how come there are around about 500 million smallholders, people with less than 2 hectares of land around the world. Essentially, why are they still there? Why haven't they disappeared? In countries like Vietnam, Thailand, these are upper middle income countries. They should have gone the way of, peasants in Europe and North America, but they're still there. That for me is really interesting. So a little bit like kind of Melissa and James Fairhead's work on, and if you remember the work of Mary Tiffin in the Machakos district of Kenya, more people, less erosion. How does that happen? So, I'm going to return to the other thing. How we choose, where we go to find our questions and our evidence. Just to finish, at the moment I'm doing a systematic literature review on outdoor work, health, and climate change in Vietnam. And we've done a systematic literature review of the English language literature and the Vietnamese language literature. They tell different stories. And most literature reviews are English or European language literature reviews. So there's a whole chunk of work we don't even look at for a whole set of reasons to do with I think James was saying we need to talk the common language. I think the issue is we don't. And that's significant as well.
This is not a myth, but something like a common pattern that I've observed during this conference is that I think this is because of the rush to publish, really, and students and practitioners and even as scholars, we no longer spend time in the villages to learn from people and understand their ways of life and their livelihoods, because everything is so rushed. And I know years ago, people who enroll in a PhD program, they often have to spend the whole year in the villages, but nowadays we don't have time for this, and this explains why we are quite disconnected and we don't really understand people's livelihoods and we make assumptions. Thank you.
Really important to keep in mind. So I have one final question before I turn it over to the audience. I wanted to come back to this theme of the conference, imagination and innovation, and I wanted to ask the panelists, but I also want to ask you all, and you'll get a chance to have your input later on a poll, to sort of imagine what how would you want to reimagine our forest futures? Reimagine our relationship with forests and what we mean by sustainable landscapes or just landscapes. Can we picture in our head, what is our end goal? And if you have that picture in your head, then what is it that FLAIR can be doing to help us get there? What research needs to be done? What policy needs to be enacted? What practice needs to be spread to get us to that reimagined future? And I want to ask each one of you to just something, one item that you think we should be doing in the next 10 years.
Can I start? Yeah, the only thing I was thinking when I listened to you and think about reimagination, then I think we have to live in harmony with the forest, with nature. So just take what you need from the forest and give forest the chance to restore itself. And how to do this? Yeah. Then we come back to the policymakers. So everyone agree that we are facing climate change and forest is the solution. But still, you have policy where there are policy on deforestation, the farming in Brazil, it's logging, and all this kind of thing. So our need is more than the Mother Earth can provide us. So in my imagination is that we will have to be one in nature again and not to overcharge the forest.
How about we start from the end and work our way this way? James?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, still thinking, Reem. I think for me, it's value. I think we need a fundamental shift in valuing forests and forest livelihoods properly. And I think that's linked to what Professor Rigg said yesterday, what Evie said and other panelists around the concept of care. I don't think value has to be economic. It's far more than that. The economic piece matters too. And we need to do it to shift incentives so that forests are seen as worth more standing or more sustainably used, I should perhaps say, than extracted as part of a sort of an extractive economy. And so those that steward them are rewarded for those efforts.
I think, thinking of my perspective as a student and kind of being part of the younger generation, I think that my imagined future for my generation is seeing the environment as the central issue, not just as like there are some more radical people at universities who are protesting and they're going to do that because they care, but seeing it as the issue. This is the issue of our generation. And when students begin to see the environment as the central issue, allowing students and youth voices to be uplifted, I especially think in college campuses, how when my own experience as someone who's tried to get the University of Notre Dame to divest from fossil fuels and holding protests and being completely stifled and having a lot of repression from the university of not being open about what percentage of their very, very large endowment is invested in the fossil fuel industry. And when students try and engage in protesting and challenging their institutions to act more quickly to save the environment, oftentimes those actions are stifled. So centralizing the environment as the issue of my generation, but then also allowing those voices to be uplifted and not seeing it as something radical or crazy, but seeing it as something that is reacting to the issue of the time. And I think that maybe a policy or an implementation that could go with that is having universities kind of rethink the way that they use student activism and just think that the way that they use student voices that are calling for change and not just stifling that and saying that nothing can be done, because that's often the response we get, is that nothing can be done, it's a bureaucratic issue, talk to this person and this person, but instead saying, we take your issue seriously, you are right, there is ample science that supports what you're saying, and beginning to accept that student voices are going to continue to be there. That's what I was saying.
So my reimagined future as a social science scholar from the global south, and also like from our active engagement with policy and communities, forest neighboring communities that are entrusted with the rights to manage and to own their forests. Communities that are standing on their feet and probably not needing us, not needing NGOs or the government to tell them what to do. Thank you.
I've been sitting here panicking, thinking, what will I say? And it changed. It changed 3 or 4 times, then it worked out and things, so I got on a bunch of stuff. But anyway, as I was listening to her, I was thinking of that axiom that, you know, the world has problems, universities have departments. And I think that kind of captures a lot of the issue that we've got. You know, we all sort of hold up in our little corners and we burrow away. I mean, I'm talking as academic, doing stuff which, you know, is read by a handful of people, and, you know, forests and the challenges we've been hearing about over the last 2 days demand more than that. I'm not quite sure how to do it, but anyway, that axiom came to mind.
Thank you all. So I would like to open up to the audience for questions.
Thank you very much for the inspiring sharing that you just had. I was thinking a lot of things while you were speaking, and I was unable to stop thinking about what Mariluz, the Kukama Indigenous Women President from the Amazon that we have here today, she was sharing with me some messages about threats against her life, and the burden of having to have all the time fighting. So when we are talking about indigenous people's rights, I was wondering, what are we doing? I would like, please, to share from your perspectives, from academics or advocates, what to do when there is this constant demand of products and services that come from places like in the Amazon, and there is a constant threat and violence against indigenous peoples' bodies as well as territories. As academics, what can we do to support this on the ground? I understand that the recognition of rights is very important, and at the same time we need to stop the drivers of that violence on the ground.
Thank you for this very interesting panel and discussion. So, from what I hear in this panel, but also in the previous days, makes it feel like the problem is the smallholders. And here again, I hear that the problem is the youth not caring. And I'm wondering, is that like youth and smallholders, are they actually the problem? Or is it something else, like a global capitalist system that we should name, and that I fear that here we are not even able to name it, as if it was forbidden to name it. Come on! So, and I fear that this is because we lack imagination. And I heard in different conversations that, you know, yeah, but if it's not capitalism, yeah, you know, it's the gulag. Come on, we are researchers, we are able to think beyond that, right? So we should be able to think about different types of systems, different types of relationships, different types of post-capitalist economies that we should think and imagine today to be able to fight the right fights, the right struggles. And I think we are capable of that, but I mean, what about having sessions on that topic? Thank you.
So I think one more question there.
Hard to go after that. Feel a bit inadequate now. So I had a question for Sarobidy and James. I mean, I do a lot of work on impact evaluation, And I'm trying to formulate this and make sense of this. Essentially, I see kind of three issues. On the one hand, doing rigorous evaluation in science takes a lot of time. The problems change very quickly. So by the time we generate the evidence and have managed to lobby, the problems change. And so we end up in this kind of conundrum that I feel like we're basically 10 years out of date. And I wonder whether, it'd be great to hear your reflections about how we can be more nimble, both as scientists and at that science policy interface.
Thank you. So, some difficult questions here for you all. Glad I'm just moderating. So, a question about what we can do as academics to help Indigenous struggles. Rights aren't enough. There's more that needs to be done. One on whether or not we should be just challenging the global capitalist system instead of pointing blame at other actors, and a third one on impact evaluations. So, I leave it up to you who wants to respond to either of those questions.
I can answer the second one, or at least give it a shot, and maybe others, Hugo, maybe the first one. Anyway, but you're absolutely right. The reason why smallholders don't sell their 2 hectares or whatever it is because the work they're doing is profoundly precarious, and that's because of the casualization of the formal sector over much of the world. And I've been working 2 small villages in Thailand for 40 years, and when I first went there, I interviewed 81 households. I went back there 2022, so 2 years ago. 74 of them still have land in that village. That's just extraordinary. Thailand's gone from low income to upper middle income over that period, and you think, now why? And it is because of the nature of late capitalism. So you tie the existence, and the same in Nepal, the story about how come they're still there when they can go to the Middle East to work and earn, because of the precarity. There's a precariat out there, if you read Guy Standing's work, that explains, or one of the possible reasons why smallholders persist. And you tie that in, and with COVID, global financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, you talk to farmers and they say, well, why would I sell my land when I lose my job like that? So absolutely, and there's some really good work on that.
I don't know your name, but I want to thank you for bringing that up. I think one of the kind of advantages that younger people in universities and coming into scholarly fields today have is not knowing, almost like a blissful ignorance of not knowing what can and can't be talked about. And so because we have that, we can kind of say that there are certain things like capitalism and colonialism and Orientalism and white supremacy that can be named, even when, and there was a discussion in one of the first opening panels of kind of naming, prioritizing decolonization as something that needs to be talked about more in fields of climate change and forests and livelihoods. And so when I heard that, I was thinking that youth who are interested in this topic and who are passionate about this topic are naming colonialism and are naming capitalism as being the root drivers to a lot of the issues. And so I think that is an advantage of people that are coming into scholarly work of not falling into the kind of taboos of this thing is going to be popular, this thing isn't, but of kind of reshaping what can be talked about and what can't be. So I appreciate you naming that.
A quick reply to Johan. I think I didn't make myself clear. I wasn't really advocating for rigors because that's not always possible, and it takes time, many years. So for the past 4 years, we've been engaging with conservation practitioners, those that manage protected areas, and a common observation we had is that they hardly do any impact evaluation at all. They just do monitoring, really, tracking, for instance, the number of people they've trained in, let's say, some practices. And I guess my point is that there are like different levels of impact evaluation, like requiring some like different levels of expertise and cost as well that we can implement in the real world. So maybe for some cases it might be possible to implement this like rigorous impact evaluation methods, but in some other cases some evidence like given like can be quite pragmatic or something that are implemented by the practitioners themselves would be valuable. And at the same time, we also need to, in parallel, engage with the policymakers and engage in capacity building activities to help communities to be able to negotiate their rights and to express their needs and aspirations. Thank you.
Yeah, I can come in. Thank you. Blimey, some brilliant questions here. I think on this question here, I sort of alluded in my opening remarks of this distinction between politics and policy. I think it's relevant to that. Obviously, you as researchers have space and the skills to reimagine different forms of political thinking and economic thinking, which are enormously valued and valuable. I think us in policy, that doesn't absolve us, I think, in policy making of responsibility. So, you know, so much of the work we do is in the minutiae, actually. It's in the delivering at the ground level, it's in administration. I very much follow Hugo and Bourdieu, some of this thinking of the kind of the fact that an idea isn't necessarily bad, right? A discourse isn't necessarily bad, but they are dangerous. And I think we have a responsibility in policy to watch that line of danger and make sure, as I've said, the way that politics is instantiated in policy is fair, is just, as we've discussed. And I know we've touched on this idea of justice as well. On the question, Andrea's question on IPOCs in particular, I mean, I can talk about the stuff that the UK government does in a kind of a programme capacity, I suppose, to support IPOCs, particularly around clear and secure land tenure and the work around empowerment there. But I think you're getting at a bigger issue here, right, about politics and policy. We do advocacy, but again, we discussed last night, there is a real challenge, I think, around how we have meaningful representation of those communities in a world bound by concepts of nation state. On this third question, you really picked up on something that I wish I'd sort of pulled out more in my initial remarks around time. Time is really a really big challenge for us. Actually, we have the time of the environmental challenges that we have and needing to deliver within that time frame. We have the time in which it takes a programme to be developed to respond to a challenge, or the time that I have to work with counterparts on a sort of a more diplomatic footing. And I share that question. I don't have the answer, which is a really unsatisfying response. But I think maybe we start from recognition that there is this temporal dislocation between what we're trying to achieve and the conversation we're having between academia and policy. And I can only see the answer as at the moment of making that explicit and naming it, coming to the table and thinking about how we can work through that challenge together. A bit of an anodyne response, but I think it's good that we recognise there is that challenge.
So I've been given the signal that we're needing to wrap up. I think those questions present fantastic opportunities for future FLAIR discussions, and I totally agree. Why not have a session on imagining a post-capitalist forest-people relationship, or having a session where we get together and brainstorm and think about, what can we do to advance these struggles and address these drivers and these crucial issues.
Let's thank the panelists and Reem for a really rich Okay, we're done. See you next year. truly, I have maybe less than 1 minute of things to say. Really, the main thing to say at this point is just thank you. Thanks to all of you for a really fantastic panel, fantastic questions, challenging ones. This is serious business. I will reiterate that this is your network, our meeting. So if you have ideas for things that you want to discuss and present, these kinds of issues that were raised, propose them, organize them. This is a forum for this kind of discussion. So thanks to all the plenary speakers and all the people that presented the fantastic research and all the discussion that we've had over these days. I want to just close with a word of thanks to the Antananarivo staff. The food was, I thought, spectacular. We all seem to have been hydrated continuously, which was fantastic, and caffeinated and all of that. And this is just a fantastic room. It feels cozy. At first it feels intimidating to be up here, but it's become kind of cozy, I think. So thanks so much to the staff here, the Notre Dame staff who really helped us. We're based in the US, organizing a meeting here. That was great. All of the Notre Dame students, Brian Wamba, Katya Nakamura, the Secretariat, Beverly, thank you so much. I'd like to ask you to stand if you were a student, or Katya or Brian, so that we can give you thanks. Great. I'm supposed to announce the next Flair meeting location, but I can't because I don't know what it will be. Sorry. But we do have some good candidates, so stay tuned. It's a cliffhanger. We will definitely follow up with you. Happy birthday to Flair, and thank you so much for a great meeting. Take care.